can have your
main event of the evening.
Sherlock Holmes, ready to race to you.
These days are
Hello and welcome to These Days Are Ours, a Happy Days podcast. I'm Peter.
And I'm Joe.
And today, we're discussing the series finale of the Fonz and the Happy Days gang. Give me a hand, something's afoot. Boy, it seems like just yesterday, we were watching the gang get stranded in prehistoric times, and Fonzie swang on a vine for the first time.
Okay, Peter, tell us what happens and give me a hand, something's afoot.
Fonzie has been making his way through Cupcake's list of repairs to the time machine as it speeds through time and space.
which is quite an accomplishment even for the Fonz.
Unfortunately,
There's one he hasn't gotten to yet. When the time machine passes the year 1111,
it malfunctions and sends them spiraling through time again. They land in London in the year 1894.
Fonzie's just glad they aren't in a war zone again.
But they do hear a woman calling for help as she runs down the street, being chased by a menacing-looking carriage with an evil old man inside, being driven by a beefy henchman.
After the girl, McCracken. Don't let her get away.
Fonzie leaps to the rescue, and with a snap of his fingers causes the henchman to let go of the reins and end up hanging from a lamppost. While the gang is talking to the grateful woman, who introduces herself as Joanna Sweeney, the old man rescues his henchman, and they plot to eliminate her. The old man runs up to the gang, claiming to be her father.
This man is not my father.
You must excuse Johanna, sir. She is not well.
But obviously, no one believes him,
Especially not when another man shows up, because Mr. Cool landed on his doorstep,
and declares that this old man is none other than Professor Moriarty.
and his henchman, McCracken. Cupcake tries to zap him, only to give him a flying contraption which he gladly escapes with. The other man is none other than Sherlock Holmes.
It was the least Sherlock Holmes could do.
You mean the Sherlock Holmes?
Joanna was on her way to visit him for help.
Yesterday, her father suddenly didn't recognize her, and then he didn't come home that night. Of course, Holmes will help her.
And so will Fonzie and Mr. Cool, while the rest of the gang guards the time machine.
They begin their investigation at the Tower of London, where Joanna's father, Todd Sweeney, works as a guard for the Crown Jewels. And they almost immediately find him.
And he recognizes his daughter just fine.
Joanna, darling. You've come to visit your old dad. And you brought friends, too.
He claims he had pretended not to recognize Joanna yesterday as a joke, and he did go home last night. He just came and went while Joanna was asleep.
Joanna confides to Fonzie and Holmes.
That man isn't my father.
And a few feet away, Sweeney removes his mask to reveal to the audience that he's actually Moriarty. Back at the time machine, Richie and Ralph ask Cupcake to zap them period-appropriate clothes, and she ends up putting them all in fancy spacesuits.
Cupcake? Oh, moon craters! I'll get it right this time for sure.
A second zap hits the time machine, turning it into an old-timey, but still anachronistic for 1894, automobile. Cupcake gets them back in their regular clothes,
And the three of them take the car to go check on the others at the tower.
they spot Moriarty leaving, and surround him alongside Fonzie, Holmes, and Joanna. However, he escapes using a grappling hook in his cane.
Thank you, King Cook. I got a grappling hook.
He drops a ticket for a boat leaving for France tonight, and Holmes vows they'll be waiting for him before he boards. That night, Holmes gets on the vessel, only for the gang to spot
Moriarty not on the boat.
It was all a trick to get Holmes out of the way, as Holmes loudly shouts from the departing boat somehow.
It was a trick, my friend. A ruse to trap me aboard this vessel, leaving Moriarty free to pursue his evil scheme.
The next boat back won't be until tomorrow, so it's up to the gang to stop Moriarty's evil plan. Fonzie sends Cupcake, Richie, and Ralph back to the tower, while he, Joanna, and Mr. Cool track down Moriarty's coach. They follow it to an old warehouse, where McCracken traps them in a cage where the bottom starts opening over a watery pit. At the tower, Cupcake, Richie, and Ralph
Find the real Todd Sweeney tied up and gagged. Cupcake tries to zap him free.
only to turn him into a mummy that begins to chase them. They make it back to the Crown Jewels display, where they run into Moriarty having just stolen them. Richie scolds him.
Now, just a minute, bucko.
Stealing is dishonest and illegal. Moriarty is not swayed.
Cupcake tries to zap him, only to instead turn the bars on a window into nice curtains. Moriarty jumps out and drives off with McCracken.
And then the trio get arrested for stealing the Crown Jewels.
I arrest you in the name of Her Majesty for the theft of the Crown Jewels of England.
Back in the warehouse, Fonzie opens the cage with a snap of his fingers, so he, Joanna, and Mr. Cool get out and do not drown. Richie, Ralph, and Cupcake are imprisoned in a cell in the tower. When Cupcake tries to zap them out, she causes the walls to start closing in on them.
Where's Fonzie when you really need him? Right here, Mal.
Luckily, Fonzie shows up and unlocks the door before they can get crushed. The gang go back to Moriarty's hideout. Fonzie and Mr. Cool go up to the second floor, while the rest of the gang search the first floor. They end up hiding in a box on a cart.
Which McCracken drives to Moriarty's laboratory.
Due to a draft,
Cupcake begins sneeze zapping.
all the way there.
In his lab,
Moriarty is using the crown jewels to power the world's
first laser destruction ray.
Cupcake sneeze zaps a rainbow above the box, so Moriarty turns his laser destruction ray upon it, revealing the four hiding. Richie tries to put them under citizen's arrest,
You're under citizen's arrest, bucko.
and Cupcake's attempt to zap
The villains only traps the four of them in a bubble. Before Moriarty can use his laser destruction ray to make himself the ruler of London,
Fonzie shows up and swings up by a rope, of course, to tussle with
Moriarty over the laser destruction ray,
It ends up firing on Moriarty's lab, and then Fonzie snaps his fingers.
causing all the jewels to fall out.
Then Mr. Cool traps McCracken in a box. Richie asks how Fonzie found them. Did he use logic and deduction, like Sherlock Holmes?
Kinda. He followed the trail of weird stuff Cupcake sneeze zapped. Moriarty is about to make his escape in the car, so Cupcake zaps it back into a time machine.
That villain's not going anywhere in my time machine.
The next morning, Holmes returns to London and deduces that they handled the case without him.
Then Cupcake sneezes again, zapping everyone into circus attire.
I deduced you managed the case perfectly well without me.
Well, I wouldn't say perfectly.
And neither would we.
Thank you, Peter. That was Give Me a Hand, Something's Afoot. It first aired back on November 28th, 1981. The final new episode of The Fonz and the Happy Days Gang was followed by a rerun of the Richie Rich Scooby-Doo show. The Fonz and the Happy Days Gang remained on the ABC schedule in reruns for the rest of the season, and Fonzie also appeared in animated adventures with Laverne and Shirley that continued to air until 1983. CBS aired the Bugs Bunny Roadrunner show, and NBC had a new episode of The Smurfs, in which Clumsy steals a magic spell from Gargamel and turns himself into a dragon. So, Peter, of those three choices, what are you watching?
Probably the Smurfs, I guess. I've realized over the course of doing this show that I am fascinated by the Smurfs. Everything about them raises so many new questions, and every answer just raises even more questions.
I am definitely watching that episode of The Smurfs. I want to see first how Clumsy manages to steal anything from anybody because, as his very name tells you, he is clumsy.
Fonzie, knock it off.
Okay, Hefty.
Give Me a Hand, Something's Afoot was directed by Ray Patterson, George Gordon, and Rudy Zamora. It was written by Dwayne Poole and Tom Swale. As for songs this week, when the gang arrives in London, we hear a bit of Rule Britannia.
This is London, England, in the year 1894.
A British patriotic song composed in 1740 by Thomas Arne and based on a poem by James Thomson. It is not the national anthem of England, but it is closely associated with the Royal Navy. Now, Peter, for some reason, I was laboring under the delusion that Rule Britannia was England's national anthem. Do you know what the national anthem actually is?
God Save the Queen? I guess now it's God Save the King again because the old Queen is dead.
As for cultural and historical references, this week the gang find themselves in London in the year 1894, where they meet the legendary detective Sherlock Holmes. This character debuted in a series of novels and short stories by Scottish physician Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, published between 1887 and 1927, but that was just the beginning. The character has since appeared in every possible medium, especially film, TV, and theater, and there may be as many as 25,000 adaptations of Sherlock Holmes, making Holmes the most portrayed character in all of English literature, and that's not even counting the parodies, ripoffs, and wannabes. Peter, what did you think of the portrayal of Sherlock Holmes in this episode?
He's not very bright in this.
He gets tricked by Moriarty into boarding that boat so easily. The real Sherlock Holmes obviously wasn't going to fall for it, or if he did, he would have just pretended to fall for it. So this is not Holmes' best showing. I guess that's what happens when Watson isn't there to ground him.
I guess not. It seemed to me that with Sherlock Holmes, the show had the same problem that it had with King Arthur and the Three Musketeers. They introduce this famous literary character, and then they have no idea what to do with him, and they come up with this contrived reason to keep him off screen for a big part of the story. So this was a big disappointment. The episode's title is a reference to one of Holmes's most famous quotes, "The game is afoot." This line appeared in the 1904 story, The Adventure of the Abbey Grange. The full quote is,
"Come, Watson, come. The game is afoot."
The expression "the game is afoot" actually goes back to Shakespeare's 1599 play Henry V, and in this episode, actor Henry Pollock actually gets to say the famous line.
Then the game is afoot.
Certain aspects of Holmes's appearance and dress, such as his deerstalker cap and plaid cape, come from the illustrations that accompanied Doyle's stories when they appeared in magazines, namely The Strand in England and Collier's in America. Physically, the Sherlock Holmes that we see in this episode is modeled on actor Basil Rathbone, who portrayed Holmes on film 14 times between 1939 and 1946.
What do you make of it, Watson? Why should I make anything of it?
For many people, Peter, Basil Rathbone is their definitive Sherlock Holmes. Do you have a definitive portrayal of Sherlock Holmes?
I am very much behind on my Sherlock Holmes media. Lately, I've been making my way through BBC Sherlock because I rewatched the H-Bomber Guy video on it, and I thought, you know what, it might be fun to watch all of it. I need to distract myself from the horrors. Once I finish it, I'm going to read the stories, and then I'm going to watch other stuff that Sherlock Holmes has been in, because he's been in basically everything, and I want to get more into him. I am very fond of The Great Mouse Detective, though.
You're invited to join the fun.
We've not a moment to lose.
With Walt Disney Pictures' The Adventures of the Great Mouse Detective, rated G.
That is one of many gateway drugs into the world of Sherlock Holmes, another being Sherlock Hemlock on Sesame Street.
Why, who are you?
Sherlock Hemlock, the world's greatest detective.
For people of my generation, the definitive Sherlock Holmes was Jeremy Brett.
Oh, sure, I love that show. Jeremy Brett is one of the best.
For me, Jeremy Brett will always be the ideal Sherlock Holmes. He looks and talks and acts exactly like I would think Sherlock Holmes would behave.
My mind rebels at stagnation.
The villain this week is Professor Moriarty, the brilliant archenemy of Sherlock Holmes. This character debuted in a short story from 1893 called The Final Problem. Doyle first invented Moriarty specifically so he could kill Sherlock Holmes, but fans demanded that Holmes be brought back from the grave. Moriarty has since become an essential part of the Sherlock Holmes franchise. His henchman, McCracken, however, was specifically created for this episode. I would argue that this is much more a Professor Moriarty story than it is a Sherlock Holmes story.
It 100% is. And also Moriarty in this, well, he's just a pretty typical Saturday morning
cartoon supervillain.
I don't know if you noticed, but I really like the phrase laser destruction ray.
Laser destruction ray!
And I like the fact that he's not particularly subtle or crafty in his villainy.
He's really not. He is also not particularly brilliant in this episode, but hey, he almost succeeds in his goals, so he's brilliant enough. The fact that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle kind of hated Sherlock Holmes and hated writing him after a certain point, but had to keep doing it
because
he really needed the money and Sherlock Holmes was beloved by basically everyone, is so funny to me, especially considering that in the 1920s he got really into spiritualism. That's mostly funny to me because I feel like Sherlock Holmes himself would side-eye Doyle for that.
Holmes is seen emerging from his famous address, 221B Baker Street. This is a real location in London and would have been a pricey, high-class residence during the Victorian era when Holmes lived. So much of the Sherlock Holmes stories takes place within 221B Baker Street, and we never even go inside, Peter.
Well, then they would have had to design another scene, and they probably did not have the time or the budget to do that.
I will give the artists on this show some credit in that the backgrounds for this episode are pretty beautiful. They've created some really lovely Victorian London streets in the background, so I appreciated that. I don't know if kids would have at all.
You kids don't know what you want. That's why you're still kids, because you're stupid.
Joanna Sweeney's father, Todd, works as a guard at the Tower of London, protecting the crown jewels of England. The Tower of London is a historic castle in central London dating back to the 11th century. Over the years, it's been used as a royal residence, a fortress, and a prison. It remains the home of the Crown Jewels of England, a collection of ceremonial objects owned and used by British royalty, most famously St. Edward's crown. To this day, the tower and its riches are guarded by a group called the Yeoman Warders, also known as the Beef Eaters.
It tastes like beef!
And Peter, I was surprised to learn the Tower of London was still being used as a prison into the 1950s.
Oh my God.
When The Simpsons went to England, Homer got imprisoned in the Tower of London as well.
In this cell sits Homer Simpson, the most villainous blackguard to be held in this tower since Edward the Puppy Eater.
Obviously, the name Todd Sweeney is a clever reversal of Sweeney Todd, the notorious demon barber of Fleet Street who kills his customers and gives the bodies to his partner, Mrs. Lovett, who then bakes them into meat pies. The character first appeared in a serialized story called The String of Pearls from 1846. That story has since been adapted to the stage and screen numerous times, most famously a 1979 stage musical by Stephen Sondheim and Hugh Wheeler.
Sweeney Todd, the demon barber of Fleet Street, the new Stephen Sondheim Harold Prince musical thriller starring Angela Lansbury.
Is Todd Sweeney supposed to be Sweeney Todd?
I don't think so. He doesn't do anything Sweeney Todd-like in this episode. He's just a guy. At no point does he murder anyone by a special barber chair. At no point does he help anyone commit cannibalism. At no point does he have a nervous breakdown and decide that everybody in the world deserves to die because he failed to kill the one guy he really wanted to kill. But hey, his daughter's name is Joanna. That's something.
Richie says the automobile hasn't even been invented in 1894.
Cupcake, we're trying to be inconspicuous here. The automobile hasn't even been invented in 1894.
This is not accurate. Cars were invented in the 1880s and were available in England by 1892. They weren't common by any means, but they had been invented. At the dock, we see numerous signs advertising a ferry to Calais. There is indeed a ferry boat that crosses the English Channel from Dover to Calais. It's still operating today. Fonzie refers to Sherlock Holmes as Holmes and Gardens.
Too bad old Holmes and Gardens here wants to run a one-man show.
He's referring to Better Homes and Gardens, a magazine founded in 1922 and devoted to decorating, cooking, gardening, and crafts. Over 100 years later, it remains one of the most widely circulated magazines in America. Although, Peter, I have never known anyone who actually purchased a copy of Better Homes and Gardens, other than Audrey from Little Shop of Horrors.
Better homes and gardens.
I feel like most of it comes down to the name. There's something vaguely insulting about that. You don't know what my home and garden are like. How dare you tell me that someone else's are better, even if you are correct?
Richie says,
when the going gets tough, the tough get going.
This is a quote associated with American football. Though no one can agree on its exact origin, it dates back to the early 1950s and has been attributed to such coaches as John Thomas and Frank Leahy.
What do you mean attributed to?
A guard says that Richie, Ralph, and Cupcake will soon be taken to Scotland Yard.
This should hold you hooligans. Do the blokes from Scotland Yard come to take you away?
This is the headquarters of the Metropolitan Police, the organization responsible for protecting Greater London. The police have had several different headquarters in London since 1829, but at the time of this story, Scotland Yard was located in the Norman Shaw buildings on the Victoria Embankment in the city of Westminster, which is a borough of London. And Peter, when I was a child and heard that term Scotland Yard in movies and TV shows...
Did you expect it to be actually in Scotland?
I expected it to be a big yard, like somebody's backyard.
Look out of the yard.
Why? What will we see?
Ralph says,
I sure hope Ben is in 1894.
He is in luck. In the 1890s, the ideal woman was depicted as having a slim, sporty figure. This can be seen in the work of illustrator Charles Dana Gibson and his famous Gibson Girl. I didn't actually know until doing the research for this episode what a Gibson Girl was. Were you familiar with the Gibson Girl?
I was familiar with the term, but it's also one of those things that I rarely think about because it does not impact my life very often. When I was a kid, I had this book of 100 important American women. The Gibson Girl was in there, even though she wasn't actually a real person. She was just a marketing invention like Betty Crocker.
Fonzie describes himself and Mr. Cool as second-story men.
Come on, Cool. Looks like you and I have been elected second-story men.
This is a rather old-fashioned term for a burglar who enters a building through an upper-story window. And I'm mentioning it because I hear the term second-story men in old movies and TV shows, but it's one that you rarely hear anymore, and I wonder if people today actually know what a second-story man even is.
I absolutely did. Thank you for explaining that.
I literally heard it in a Three Stooges short, and I was like, what's a second story man? Like a person who tells you a story and then tells you another story? Ralph says that he and his friends are from the Welcome Wagon.
Well, actually, sir, we're from the Welcome Wagon.
Since 1928, the Welcome Wagon has been sending representatives to the homes of new residents in a community and bringing them gift baskets containing free samples, coupons, and advertising from local businesses. Kind of a nice service. And Fonzie says, oh, it is so elemental there, my dear Cunningham.
Oh, it is so elemental there, my dear Cunningham.
He's referring to another famous Sherlock Holmes quote, elementary, my dear Watson. Holmes never actually said this in any of Doyle's stories. Aww. it may come from a stage adaptation. Were you disappointed to learn that he never actually says elementary, my dear Watson?
A little bit, yeah. It's so associated with the character that there's a whole TV show named after it.
He did use the word elementary once in one story, but he doesn't say elementary, my dear Watson. Other observations, the series slips back into some old habits this week.
See, now you're slipping back in your old habits again. Why do you do that?
When the gang arrive, they immediately see a damsel in distress running from a villain.
Help! Someone, please!
As you mentioned, the version of Sherlock Holmes that we see in this episode is not terribly observant or intelligent. I think that most viewers, even small children, would notice that something was seriously wrong with Joanna's father, and Sherlock falls for the fake boat ticket scam way too easily. It's not likely that Moriarty would accidentally drop such an item. I think it's just a way to get Sherlock off screen for a long time.
It totally is, yeah.
Sherlock Holmes is shouting out what happened as exposition as the boat is driving away, conveniently while we can't see him on screen, and it reminds me of nothing so much as when the live-action show would ADR in additional dialogue when we couldn't see the actors' faces.
Moriarty literally refers to Richie, Ralph, and Cupcake as meddling kids.
It's those meddling kids.
So they're not being subtle with the Scooby-Doo comparisons.
Meddling kids is one of those phrases like the game is afoot that's just fun to hear. It makes me happy.
And since it's the last episode, it's only appropriate that the characters should find themselves locked up. That happens to them quite a lot. They do quite a lot of jail time over the course of the Fonz and the Happy Days gang.
I turned 21 in prison doing life without parole.
Cupcake says a lot of catchphrases this week. Apparently she knows it's the last week, so she's trying to get in as many as possible. She says,
cosmic comets, sizzling sunspots, moon craters 4 times, plus Ralph says it once. They might be trying to set a record for moon craters. Triple time spins, galactic goof-ups,
cosmic calamities, terrible time warps, gyroscopic geraniums, leaping leptons, crumbling comets, creeping cosmos, leaping light years, and fizzling photons.
And that turns out to be the last Cupcake catchphrase of the entire series, fizzling photons. Time for our final report on Mr. Cool. Were there times when he made things better? Yes. He uses his sniffer to find McCracken's coach. He lands on McCracken's head and briefly blinds him. A few minutes later, he closes McCracken inside a wooden crate and nails it shut, which is remarkable dexterity for a dog. Were there times when Mr. Cool makes things worse? There were none that I could see. Peter, were there any times when he made things more difficult?
No, he was very helpful in this episode. Good showing for the final episode of the show ever.
Were there times when Mr. Cool suffers physically and mentally? Of course there were. In trying to imitate Fonzie, he goes flying through Sherlock Holmes' window. Later, Fonzie brushes him off to protect his leather jacket, and Mr. Cool falls to the ground, suffering a mild concussion. He falls off a bridge into a moat. When a cage door closes, it knocks him into a pile of wooden crates. He escapes only to have more crates fall on top of him, and he hits himself in the thumb, or whatever dogs have instead of a thumb, with his hammer.
Mr. Cool is a dog, very loosely.
He's basically somewhere between human and animal. So, Peter, were there any outstanding Happy Days fashions in Give Me a Hand, Something's Afoot?
I really loved Joanna's green, old-timey, late Victorian dress. It's got the long sleeves that poof at the shoulders. It's got the high collar. She's got the Gibson girl hair, as discussed. She looks great.
So, Peter, I will ask that age-old, timeless question. Was this episode any good?
I feel like this episode kind of dragged at the beginning.
But once it got to Moriarty and his laser destruction ray and his desire to become the ruler of London, not even like all of England, just London specifically, then it really picked up for me.
This episode disappointed me a little because I was expecting a Fonzie Sherlock Holmes team-up, and it barely qualifies as that. Holmes doesn't actually do much in this story, and then they contrive a way to keep him off screen. But as we get further into the caper, it gets more exciting, and obviously Professor Moriarty's plan is so insane to turn the crown jewels into a laser death ray that he's going to use. Like, how would that work? How are we supposed to figure out that as a mystery? It's not really a solvable mystery, I don't think, Peter, because I don't think we can say, like, oh, obviously he's trying to get the crown jewel so he can build a laser out of him. So this is a fun story, but I'm not sure that it works as a good or even adequate Sherlock Holmes story.
It is an absolutely terrible Sherlock Holmes story.
This almost amounts to character assassination for Sherlock Holmes. Many, many things have been done with the character over the years, and this is probably one of the worst. But it's not a terrible episode by any means.
The Fonz and the Happy Days gang is not a show that really feels like it can have a real series finale, because that's just not how the show is. It is very episodic and formulaic. But at the same time, if this is going to be the last episode ever, it doesn't have the right amount of gravitas. I mean, I know we can't actually see the gang make it back to 1957 Milwaukee.
But for their final episode, they could have maybe had it end with, and the adventures continue.
This doesn't wrap up anything or feel like a conclusion to the story in any way. I thought they could have at least given it sort of a Calvin and Hobbes type ending where they get back on the time machine and then you see the time machine disappear and you just know that they're going to go off on other adventures. But that's not how it ends at all. It ends with them, as you said, in circus costumes. And I believe the last thing we see in the series is Ralph Malph dressed as a ballerina with falsies.
Yes. Somebody had to draw that.
I think that kind of summarizes the tone of the Fonz and the Happy Days gang. So it is an appropriate way to end the series, I guess. Ralph Malph with fake boobs is how we go out. Okay, so Peter, how can people keep up with us and find out about all the wonderful things we are doing?
Listeners can follow me on Blue Sky at Peter Wolfgang, bsky.social.
And they can follow me on Blue Sky at joeblevins.bsky.social. They can find this podcast online at thesedaysaroours.libsyn.com. And they can email us with questions, comments, and concerns at thesedaysaroourspodcast@gmail.com. So, Peter, what do we have on the docket next time we talk?
Next time, with the Fonz and the Happy Days gang finally over, we are going to go over our top 5 episodes of the show.
And we will be giving our overall thoughts on Fonz and the Happy Days gang and how the series developed and what we thought of it in general. So, see you later, alligator.
In a while, crocodile.
Mystery is made possible by a grant from Mogul Corporation.
Laser destruction ray.